Thank you all for taking time today to join us. It's wonderful to see so many familiar names and faces. We are joined by museum members and interested guests and also members of the Circus Historical Society. So it's nice to have this big gathering with us. As Laura mentioned, this is the second in a series that we have undertaken at the museum. In the spirit of this year of adapting, we've decided that this format is one way that we can explore topics that are a little bit more difficult than we can suss out through label texts in our galleries. The history of the circus is such a rich topic, and I find after many years working in it that a lot of people come to it with some assumptions about a lot of the questions that we're grappling with today about racism and sexism and ableism in historic circus. And these are not easy topics to grapple with because every story is rounded. And it's really important to me that we look at all sides. We look at the context that situated the circus and the allied arts in history, the influences of a broader culture, and the unique stories of the people who participated in it. So we see this program as a way to really open up those questions and have meaningful discussion about what life was like with the circus, what kind of things were represented, how we feel about these things today. It's a chance to learn more and to understand. And so to that end, we are diving into questions about the presentations of different kinds of people and animals. Today, we'll be learning about Millie-Christine McCoy, and I am thrilled to be joined today by Betsy Golden Kellem. I have known Betsy for a number of years now. She has done research with us in the archives, and I think that her approach to circus history is wonderfully rich because she comes at it with a broader background. So Betsy is an attorney and a historian, and through both of these roles, she explores how people consume, regulate, and enjoy mass media. She's currently serving as a marketing and intellectual property counsel for a Fortune 5 health and retail company. And at the same time, she is working as a historian, exploring where we're headed as a society as a direct product of what we enjoy, what we question, and where we spend our recreational time and energy. Her writing has been featured in a number of different outlets: the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Vanity Fair, Smithsonian, and Atlas Obscura. These writings are wonderful little explorations of quirky history and thoughtful perspectives from today. She also founded a blog, which I highly recommend, Drinks with Dead People, exploring again some of these wonderful little nuanced stories of history. And she's taught at Yale University and the University of Connecticut School of Law. And on top of this, she's a mom too. So I feel like I should give her an extra thumbs up for grappling with all of those things. She is a member of the board of directors of the Barnum Museum in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and loves P.T. Barnum, is one of the people that I go to when I need to know more about what Barnum would have thought. And she's currently working on a project which overlaps beautifully with what we're here today to talk about unusual women performers. And so to that end, I invited Betsy to join us and give us a perspective on Millie-Christine McCoy, and to allow us to open up some conversation at the end about how do we ethically talk about history. So Betsy, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. That was such a great introduction, and I'm thrilled that so many of you are taking time out of your day to be here. Thank you, and hopefully I'll make it worthwhile. So welcome. Maybe just a little bit of expectation setting up front. Today we're going to spend some time with Millie-Christine McCoy, a truly remarkable woman. Millie-Christine was a pair of conjoined twins, and as she became world famous in the 19th century as a performer, and not just in the sideshow sort of mode you might expect, we're going to take a look at what that meant. Things like, how did she define herself and her experience, and why? What was her life story? How can we understand her using many of those different lenses that Jennifer mentioned? And what can we learn, especially in terms of her agency as she got older? There's a lot here, and we can only scratch the surface in a very short time together, but we're going to do our best. First things first, and this is an important discussion to have here, pronouns. Not just a hot modern topic, but it's historically relevant too. It's important to start with a little bit of housekeeping and a question. how do we talk about Millie-Christine? If you look through accounts and materials at the time, there's a ton of variety. And it may seem like a little bit of a mental puzzle and maybe even a source of a little bit of discomfort to think about how to speak about her. But for the sake of accuracy and for the sake of dignity, it's an important question to ask. How we call someone says something about us, and how they wish to be understood helps us learn about them. So Millie-Christine, as I said, they were conjoined twins, joined together at about the waist. They shared certain physical features across the midsection, but the twins were distinctly separate from the torso upward. They walked together, coordinated on 4 legs. Now, I've just said they, but though she consisted of 2 joined bodies, there were individual names, individual thoughts, individual actions. And Millie-Christine thought of herself as a singular being, and she referred to herself in that way. Her mother talked about the twins as, quote, my child. So a newspaper account from the early 1880s said that Millie-Christine always speaks of herself with either mouth indifferently as I, never saying the plural we, to which she is clearly entitled. So throughout this presentation and in general, I will refer to Millie-Christine with the singular pronoun as she preferred. Probably good to sit and take in a little background first. And there's definitely a lot of story to tell. So Millie-Christine was born in 1851 in Columbus County, North Carolina. Her parents were named Jacob and Monimia, and they were enslaved by a man named Jabez McKay, who was a farmer and blacksmith in North Carolina. Millie-Christine weighed 17 pounds at birth, and by all accounts, Monimia's labor was unremarkable aside from the obvious. And unsurprisingly, word spread around the area after Millie-Christine was born about this unusual baby. And she was barely a year old when McKay came to the conclusion that he would A, really like to monetize this whole situation, and B, outsource the hassle and the foot traffic of doing so if he could help that. So in the spring of 1852, and remember, the twins are about 10 months old at this point, McKay found a promoter, entered into a contract, and the man's name was Purvis, and they entered a contract for $1,000 and a quarter of the proceeds to exhibit Millie-Christine as a curiosity, and that the twins' mother would be permitted to go with her as a caregiver. This deal involved the promoter taking Millie-Christine on the road and giving McKay, as their owner, a 25% share of the profits, as well as that share if the twins were ever to be sold. And under that contract, Monimia, the girl's mother, was to join the twins on the road, but she would be returned to McKay if the girls were sold. So it's a very disturbing degree of commoditization that's going on here. Details over the next month are not very solid, but we do know that this promoter, Purvis, eventually did sell Millie-Christine in 1853 to a man whose name was Brower. And sources are inconsistent on to how much was paid. And of course, as we see in all kinds of circus and allied arts literature, later promotion inflated this amount by a lot. But whatever it was, Brower didn't have it in cash. So he had to sign a promissory note, and he found this man named Joseph Pearson Smith to co-sign for him, essentially. Bear with me at this point. The story is a whole lot of drama at this point, and it is both complicated and kind of terrible. So this Brower was initially successful showing Millie-Christine at things like state fairs and other venues. And he figured it was time to head to New Orleans and try the big time without Millie-Christine's mother. Of note, not only was he not really an experienced showman, he was both unsuccessful and gullible. Bad combination. Someone who's only identified as an Texan offered him $45,000 for Millie-Christine, and he jumped on that offer, but handed Millie-Christine over prior to receiving payment, and you can probably guess how that went. He never saw the Texan or his money again. So he skulked back to North Carolina and informed Mr. Smith, his co-signer, that he was bankrupt. He had no idea where Millie-Christine was, and hey, about that promissory note. So effectively, Joseph Smith was now the twins' owner, and Monimia, their mother, was predictably terrified and heartbroken. To his credit, Smith paid off the debt. He hired a private investigator and got to work trying to find her. So the private eye started chasing Millie-Christine for months upon months and was kind of pinging around the Northeast to some of the usual suspects in the entertainment industry at the time. He went to Philadelphia, to New York, where they had appeared at Barnum's American Museum, to Boston, to Newark, ultimately did not find her, but discovered that someone matching her description had been rumored aboard a steamer heading for Liverpool. This was true. Millie-Christine had been taken abroad by yet another set of owners, men named William Thompson and William Millar. They claimed to have purchased her in Boston. Keep in mind, the twins they're toddlers at this point, and that between the influence of hearsay and memory and uncertainty, exactly what was the case, we're not totally sure. The things we do know, Millie-Christine was bandied about from the hands of one showman to another repeatedly at an age when most children are in preschool. And by 1855, she was on a boat headed for England. In England, she drew rave reviews, made her way from Liverpool to London. More drama at this point. One of the two partners decided to take off with Millie-Christine and headed to Scotland. His partner, not to be discouraged, hired a bunch of street toughs to try and beat him up and steal her back. There's letters going back to North Carolina at this point, kind of trying to inform Joseph Smith and the twins' mother what's going on. The negotiations, the feuds continue for more than a year. All the while, they're still touring. So Joseph Smith, with the girl's mother, sails for Liverpool, arrives on New Year's Day, 1857. Millie-Christine, later in a biographical pamphlet she wrote, describes a plan where the idea was that the kind of rescue party would show up to one of her performances unannounced and hope that Millie-Christine would recognize her mother, and that would be presumptive proof of their relationship. Eventually, this did go to the English courts, who returned Millie-Christine to her mother. Not to be discouraged, all of the promoters immediately pivoted and tried to hire her back and offered £10,000 in an English country estate. And Monimia, the girl's mother, was not having a word of this. The routine, that said, didn't change much. Still, the family at this point went around to different cities and towns. They held levies for ticket buyers. And again, she's just 5 years old at this point. But the American contingent was maybe a little less pleased than they let on with this arrangement. The promoter, Millar, found one day, via the newspaper no less, that they had skipped town. They had sneaked out, found a steamer, and headed back to the United States. Heading back to North Carolina for the first time, bringing Millie-Christine back to a sense of home and family life. So back at home, Mrs. Smith educates Millie-Christine, teaches her reading and writing, crafts, music, finally giving her the space to play like the young child she in fact was. Mr. Smith, for his part, was not ready to let go of the idea that Millie-Christine was a truly remarkable attraction, and he did figure on planning to take her to New Orleans for the usual show rodeo of engaging with doctors and promoters. Interestingly enough, the author Joanne Martel, who wrote a nice biography about Millie-Christine that I believe is out of print, but you can find it used pretty easily. Martel thinks it's more than likely that when Mark Twain wrote about Mardi Gras that year in his book, Life on the Mississippi, that the parade of sideshow attractions he described may have included Millie-Christine. Very interesting. So yeah, the girls went on a steamboat tour of the Mississippi. They continued to tour. Everything's going reasonably well until Joseph Smith dies in 1862. Smith was not financially secure, and there was an auction held to square up the estate. Mary Smith sold household items and 13 enslaved people, certainly not Millie-Christine, not least because the estate appraisers considered her worth $25,000 at that point. But consider that the Smith family at that point separated Millie-Christine from all of her friends in the world, essentially. After the Civil War ended, the Smiths and the McCoys alike were financially, politically on their heels, as many people were. And Millie-Christine decided it was up to her to provide for both families at that point. And as Martel writes, for the first time, Millie-Christine would draw her share of the profits. Her parents started out with her on tour, eventually decided to resettle the family back in Columbus County in North Carolina. And at that point, Mrs. Smith and her son Joseph were essentially acting as tour managers, running sales logistics, planning routes, that sort of thing. And what's really interesting here is from this time on, Millie-Christine tours not as a passive physical curiosity that's being put on by white male promoters, but as a unique wonder with her own talents. The promotional literature, you see titles like The Two-Headed Lady, The Double-Tongued Nightingale, The Eighth Wonder of the World, The Puzzle of Science, The Despair of Doctors, The Dual Unity. When she transitioned into circus performance in the 1880s, it's interesting to note that Millie-Christine didn't perform as a sideshow curiosity. She was not something that you would go see in a side tent. She performed as herself in the main ring. And that's a really remarkable and important distinction. Now, this doesn't mean that things were necessarily on easy street for Millie-Christine. There was a lot for her to manage. There were promotional machines that consistently bent the truth. There were the social expectations placed on women at the time, especially Black women, and the pressures that were put on the twins by the medical establishment. And I'm going to take each one of those just for a little bit. So Millie-Christine was a Black woman, formerly enslaved. She had extensive business and entertainment experience. Through the course of her touring, she had met international royalty. She spoke 5 languages. She was a skilled seamstress and made most of her own clothing. She was a talented pianist, and she was a singer who could duet with herself. She was a tough negotiator. She made enough money over her career to purchase the plantation on which she'd grown up to provide her family with land and security. She took a lot of pride in her uniqueness and her talent, with descriptions in the literature like this wonderful quote: "Remember that the opportunity of seeing this, the most marvelous wonder on earth, is afforded you but once in a lifetime, and that you have never had the pleasure and privilege of seeing her before. You may take ancient and modern history and search through, but you will not find any account of a human being ever living among the many millions that have lived since the creation that was as strange and wonderful as Millie-Christine, the Two-Headed Lady." So all of this is true, but if you look at promotional literature, at pamphlets, at posters, images, you don't always see all of this reflected. Many images, including the one on the right, as you're looking at the screen here, clearly try to depict Millie-Christine according to white norms of beauty and fashion and entertainment. Public accounts are most often written by white male promoters, doctors, journalists. Millie-Christine's biographical pamphlet, many sideshow and circus attractions would have promotional pamphlets that would be sold at different performances. Hers talks about how she had parental affection for Mr. and Mrs. Smith. But we also now know a scholar named Ellen Samuels has found out that there was a letter written by Jacob and Monimia to the Freedmen's Bureau, pleading for military assistance to recover their child from the Smith home. So all of this is a reminder that we have to read promotional literature carefully, critically. So human curiosities, unusual bodies, were big business in 19th century entertainment on both sides of the Atlantic. And there was an entire economy of supply and demand that was in place to meet the popular appetite for this kind of entertainment. By necessity, this involved medical authorities, the medical establishment participating. But it's worth noting this was not always the pure science that it was touted as. It's, it's certainly arguable that science and knowledge benefited when researchers could examine and learn from people whose bodies were not typical. But in the name of science, this examination often ended up propping up a power dynamic between performers and showmen and doctors. So it was very typical for human curiosities to go through a medical examination when they arrived in a new city. Again, outwardly, this was in the name of science, but what actually evolved was a kind of symbiotic relationship between promoters and doctors in which, tit for tat, promoters would use testimonials from respectable medical men to authenticate their claims for the paying public. People were more likely to pay and to come see a show if they knew they weren't going to be tricked into seeing something fake. And in this way, women's bodies especially were probed and pathologized by medical men, typically with a disproportionate focus on sex and marriageability for women. Women and women of color especially could expect even less deference or dignity when they were being examined. And Millie-Christine was regularly undergoing what we would consider a pretty intrusive medical exam from the time she was an infant, really. There's a scientist named George Fisher who wrote a book called Diploteratology, particularly about conjoined twins and multiple births. And he describes a physical examination of Millie-Christine when she was very young, that included not only a description of the tissue band that was connecting the girls, but a physical internal examination that included their genitals. Fisher describes their genitals in very deep detail, 2 paragraphs about their genitals, but only 1 about how they stand and walk. So that kind of gives you an idea of kind of a prurient focus that was going on here. As for questions about the twins, he had 3, and they were: 1, could they be separated? Which is a common question that's been raised about many conjoined twins. And in this case, they figured it was possible, but probably too dangerous to try unless there was a true emergency. Question 2, would they be able to marry? Logistically, yes, but morally, he did not approve. And question 3, in the afterlife, would they be resurrected as 1 body or 2? And his answer was 2. So it's a very interesting environment of inquiry, and one in which consent is not clear and it's not valued. Millie-Christine was clearly coerced on more than 1 occasion. In Philadelphia, she was brought to a man named Dr. Pancoast by Mrs. Smith when she actually had a legitimate concern, a medical issue. They were having an abscess that she wanted to have treated. And this opens the door to all sorts of examination and experiments beyond what would have been necessary to treat her. On one such visit, doctors connected the girls with electrical current and figured out which stimulus triggered which girl's muscles. And Dr. Pancoast also took an infamous photo of the twins, which is what's on the screen right now, in which they're nude, wearing only socks and boots and just a cloth for modesty. Christine is looking away from the camera, and Millie has an expression of undeniable displeasure with what's going on. The suggestion, awful as it is, as to why they agreed to this photo, reluctantly, is that the doctor may have made their treatment contingent on it. Understanding all of this, it's a very disturbing image, and the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, which is the institution that's involved with the Mutter Museum, which some of you may have been to or know about, they've redacted it, as you see here with this black square, noting that this image from the collections held at the Historical Medical Library is redacted to meet the wishes of Millie and Christine McCoy. So when Millie-Christine decided to continue touring after the end of the Civil War, she made one thing clear: there would be no more intrusive pre-show medical examinations. So the medical question and beyond makes it clear that Millie-Christine's life, seen from a distance, shows a shift in agency and in control. The story of her childhood is a story of enslavement and abduction and generally being treated as a commodity. But as a young woman and as an adult, Millie-Christine comes to assert herself more clearly and more forcefully against systems that were very ready to dismiss her for being Black, for being female, for being different. We see this especially in how she used the media and the legal system in order to stand up to people who maybe wanted to poke at her a little bit. In 1881, there was an ad in the New York Clipper, which was well known as a show business paper. And it advertised a new set of conjoined twins that were joining the show circuit. And Copy wrote about this new set of twins as the double-headed bohemian wonder. And every showman wants to pump up their newest attraction and said, well, Chang and Eng Bunker, the original Siamese twins, who were also well known at the time, and Millie-Christine were clearly inferior. This was itself not all that much of an issue. Promoters were advertising all the time. But this ad particularly called Millie-Christine, quote, repulsive in comparison to this new beauty. And Millie-Christine had a very solid sense of her own worth and of what made her both unusual and beautiful. And she thought of herself as a wonder of divine creation. So she took out an ad in reply that said, I have just read of the wonderful prodigy advertised by you in the Clipper, and cannot refrain from expressing to you my gratitude after seeing the good taste, something no one else has ever given you credit for, displayed by you in speaking of repulsive people, in that you do not mention yourself as one of them. For we of education and refinement, Mr. Uffner, would seriously object to having one classed with us who is so devoid of traits by which a gentleman is characterized as yourself. If people live to as great an age in these days as some of them did in olden times, of which I have read, no doubt you would grow to be a more monstrous monstrosity than you are, but sir, you would never grow to be a gentleman. So she did not hesitate to throw the shade. So the next year, the circus promoter Adam Forepaugh posted a competitive advertisement. You hear these called rat sheets in the business, calling Millie-Christine, quote, a horribly repulsive Negro monstrosity. She promptly responded with a libel suit in federal court in Indiana for $25,000, claiming that as exhibition was the way she made a living, Forepaugh's nasty lies were not just sticks and stones, but they were a direct threat to her ability to support herself. The lawsuit continued for 2 years until Forepaugh, keeping in mind he was one of the biggest and most fearsome executives in the circus business at the time, agreed to settle with her for an undisclosed amount. And there are rumors that he would avoid Indiana en route during this time period to avoid being served with papers. So Millie-Christine could and did put up with a lot in the name of her public exhibition, but she would not put up with insults to her humanity, her education, her uniqueness. Replies like these, like the newspaper ad, like the lawsuit, were clearly calculated to make sure that readers and promoters thought of her as a woman of dignity, someone who controlled her own affairs, and as a woman who, after a history of enslavement and exploitation, was not willing to be taken advantage of. Oops, sorry, my bad. So Millie-Christine was a differently abled Black woman. All of these aspects and the ways in which they encounter each other are important to understanding her and her identity, and we can't understand one of those without the others. It's interesting to note that Millie-Christine's typical performance presentation really spoke to ideals of 19th century womanhood. She would perform in levees that demonstrated that she was a talented dancer and musician. She would display her manners and her elocution and her social skill. She sang duets. That's a lot of where the two-headed nightingale name came from. She would talk about having visited Queen Victoria, and again, she spoke 5 different languages. All of this was part and parcel of a sense of refined, pleasing Victorian womanhood. And she performed to these standards so well, in fact, that as we saw in that slide above, the media began to think of her with reference to white norms. The writer Sarah Golds has said that, quote, "While it's possible that confusion over Millie-Christine's race stemmed from her ambiguous hair texture and complexion, it is also quite likely that her eloquence, intelligence, personality, and sartorial presentation, so different from the commonly held stereotypes about African Americans during the time period, made people assume she must be something other than simply Black." And this is in contrast to how she was presented as a child, in which she was depersonalized and she was portrayed as an exotic or strange or even animalistic outlier. And you think of other sideshow acts like Barnum's What Is It, which was displayed at the American Museum as an alleged missing link, or Ota Benga, who was a Congolese man who was displayed in 1906 in the Bronx Zoo. As a child, Millie-Christine was often namelessly just simply billed as the African Twins, or with sometimes her last name was spelled differently, McKoy, in order to make it seem more exotic and foreign. And as an adult, she resisted this. She insisted on top dollar to perform as herself in the main circus show without any exaggerated publicity or manufactured identity. For Millie-Christine, the fact that her body was unusual was not only a source of pride and wonder, but it was a means for her to accomplish what most Black Americans could not at the time: economic empowerment, agency, broad social esteem. By accounts of some of her family members, she saw this as an obligation. According to a nephew, she used her considerable fortune not only to resettle her family in North Carolina and purchase land, but she supported Black community organizations, schools, and churches with considerable donations. She was, her nephew said, a talented, generous Black woman who was one of the greatest Black women of her time. She said that when God made her, he gave her 2 heads and 2 brains because her responsibility was so great. Millie-Christine died in 1912. Millie died of tuberculosis on October 8th, and the family petitioned the governor to allow large doses of morphine for Christine, who passed the next day. The twins were buried on their family land, and they remained there until in the 1960s, their remains were exhumed and reburied in the community cemetery in Welch's Creek. And that's a tour through Millie-Christine's life and career. And I think it's probably a good point to stop here to see if anybody has any questions or if we want to guide any discussion. But thank you for being here. And I'm thrilled to be able to share this story with you.
Betsy, thank you so much for such a wonderful, insightful introduction to Millie-Christine. I invited Betsy to do this talk with us because I appreciated the fact that her background brought her to the subject of Millie-Christine because of these questions of agency and looking into the legal ramifications and the legal pursuits to have her own agency. Betsy has an insight that I think is particularly unique, and I think you did a great job of introducing that. I'm certainly ready to open the floor to questions. While we do that, I do want to say my first question for Betsy is something I grapple with all the time about how do we ethically steward stories of people who are different from us, because it's part of my job, and I more than anything, I am committed to making sure that we tell whole and rounded stories about people. And so when you dive into a topic about a person such as Millie-Christine, how do you wrangle with those questions of where there are similarities and difference, and how do you ethically tell history?
Yeah, it's a tough question, and it's kind of constantly unfolding. One of the things that I think Millie-Christine demonstrates really well is where we started saying, okay, how do we speak about her? I think that having that pronouns discussion is such a great way to kind of model this sort of inquiry, because it meant that I had to go into what they'd written, what newspaper coverage was around, anything I could find to try and cut through to her sense of self and self-identification, and to try and kind of think of her as a person and not a curiosity first and foremost. And this is in both circus and sideshow and dime museums, there is this sense of an economy and commoditized attractions and exaggerated narratives. So you have to think very carefully about what to trust and why, and who's writing what and what it serves. And, in the case of someone like Millie-Christine too, this is where I try to tread very carefully, because I'm a white lady from Connecticut. I have to be very careful about how I approach telling a story about a Black woman in the antebellum years. And I think it's important that I try to do that carefully, with deference to scholars in fields like Black history or disability studies, and kind of be as open as I can to trying to tell a plain and truthful story.
Yeah, that's great. And I really do appreciate that approach. As I said, that for me and for the Ringley Museum, I think in telling circus history, that's a really important part for us, is to be considerate of those elements that we can't fully understand. I'm going to take that moment also to do a plug that there are some wonderful people doing work on the history of Black performers in the circus. And Millie-Christine's story is also part of the Uncle Junior project, which aerialist Veronica Blair has pioneered, and Jada Hampton wrote a piece on Millie-Christine. So there are many places now to start getting the different perspectives on it. And
they have a great Instagram.
Yeah, they have a great Instagram and great media on a number of performers. They're doing important work. And I'm eager to see that we need their help, because a lot of these stories are difficult to document. Millie-Christine, you have dug up a wealth of materials that we're able to start exploring. I think, Betsy, if you maybe stop sharing your screen, I see the chat has been kind of active. So while you're doing that, I'll take a look and see. The first question I see is, with what circus did Millie-Christine perform in the ring?
She was with Doris.
The John Doris show, and that was the 1880.
Yeah, and she was engaged for $25,000 a season.
Is there a contract that shows that, or just
I'm
advertising?
not sure if there's a contract, but I've kind of found out the biography talks about her being re-signed a couple times. And actually, that after so many years on the road, one of the things that she enjoyed about the circus was having a train car that she could decorate and treat as home, because they were used to traveling. She was used to traveling so much.
Great, that's great. There's a question about her education, and particularly where she learned the many various languages. Was that while she was traveling?
That was my sense, yes, because she traveled Europe on a few different occasions, and on the later tour, pretty extensively, in England, on the continent. They went as far east as to St. Petersburg. So she was very extensively traveled and had met crowned heads of royalty in many different countries.
There's the question, did she think of herself singularly or as two distinct individuals, which I think
she thought of herself as kind of a collective I, if that makes any sense. Clearly, Millie and Christine each had distinct thoughts, but they would each refer to themselves as I.
That's, again, one of those wonderful places where research of history sometimes falls short, right? That because we don't necessarily have a memoir for her, something that she herself wrote definitively. You can look at the legal paperwork and the quotes and start to discern that, but that's where the knowing that you've really tapped all the resources is what gives you a perspective to be able to have that insight.
I saw a question pop up about slave legislation, and that was definitely an issue, both in the US and in England. There was an account during that period when Millie-Christine was very young and was kind of being spirited around the Northeast, that there were allegedly abolitionists who would try to jump on a performance in Philadelphia to say that because she was in the North, that she should be considered a free person at that point. But in England, she was also considered a free person, and that entered into the trial where they were trying to decide whether Monimia was in fact her mother.
Interesting. Okay. We just got the question of whether we know, were there any major disagreements between Millie and Christine? Is there any documentation
I
of
don't
that?
know. I'm sure there must have been. Personality-wise, Millie was said to be the more fiery of the two. But I'm sure there are always stories, and it's very hard to authenticate them. Like there's a story about Chang and Eng Bunker that they allegedly got to a fist fight in Barnum's American Museum once, and it's one of those stories that most people agree sounds better than it probably didn't happen.
It sounds very Barnum-esque, doesn't it?
It does.
To have said that. And that, I think, is a really great topic. I invite people to keep adding in questions. And I think at this point too, Laura, we could probably do hand raised if anybody wants to speak.
Sure, yeah, if anyone wants to unmute or raise your hand.
Yeah, I think that the sensitivity you showed, Betsy, towards truth in advertising, Circus is such a wonderful history to explore that with, because I do believe there's always a kernel of truth at the very least. You know, everything that's put out there in Circus PR, there's something there. And then it's the diligence of weeding it out and making sure that really what you're looking at is the good information, and that you can support it.
That's where I go back to Barnum again, where the distinction between a humbug and a swindle is you don't want to swindle your customers because then they won't come back. So there has to be that kernel of truth and kind of, a very gentle, you're going to injure nothing more than anybody's pride, really.
I mean, I see Debbie, you've got your hand raised if you'd like to jump in.
Yeah, I had typed a question that got lost in the shuffle. Did Millie-Christine form any friendships with other conjoined persons?
Not that I'm aware of. Certainly she would have met other performers and other non-traditional bodies on her travels, but I'm not aware of any. But there are mentions of others in the promotional literature. And the fact that George Fisher was able to write an entire book on conjoined twins and multiple births in that way suggests that it was not, I mean, it certainly wasn't common, but it was not uncommon either. There was a Hungarian set of twins prior to Millie-Christine. And again, some of the, that ad in the Clipper was in response to another female set of conjoined twins that was kind of coming onto the show circuit.
Any other questions out there?
And I just wanted to share, Betsy, you got a lot of accolades in the chat as well for the very sensitive presentation that you gave, very comprehensive, so people really enjoyed it. And I think everyone can agree, we're so appreciative of your expertise.
I'm glad to be here.
Most definitely. While everybody's thinking, because I think it always takes us a little bit of time, I do want to plug. Ingrid, did you raise your hand? I won't plug. I'll let Ingrid ask a question.
Okay, just curiosity. Do we happen to know whether there was ever a romantic entanglement?
We don't. Not mentioned in any of the literature that I'm aware of. Again, that's in contrast to Chang and Eng, who famously married sisters, became Confederate slave owners, and had 22 children. But no, I was not aware of any romantic interests.
Thank you.
Doesn't mean there weren't any, but I've not discovered that.
More things to research for. I wanted to take this opportunity to plug an upcoming series that we have starting next month, which we'll be bringing Betsy back because she is now one of my favorite people to lean on for great insight. Starting in April and running into May, I have convinced 6 amazing historians to come and give us some new perspectives on circus history. This happens to be a group of women who each independently, in a way, have come to the Ringley Museum to do research on their own interests. And so we've invited them to come and talk to us about the work that they've been doing. And as I mentioned, Betsy will be part of that group. Some of the others are here with us today too.
They're all amazing.
Yes, it is one of the joys of the work that I do, that I get to interact with people who are doing research into circus history. It's much too vast for any one or any 100 people to conquer. And so having these different views come through our offices really helps shape the work that I do. And I think it's really important because these voices add to the story and make it richer. And bringing them to the archives in Sarasota, having researchers come to us, we are able to interface both with the collections of history, but also with a living circus community, which I think is very important. As I mentioned, this is to me all about stewardship of people's lives, of their passions and their stories. So I'm excited to have this group join us. I think Laura was going to put a link to the program series in the chat for us. And I hope that you'll be able to come back and join us. Each one of these women will be talking about a topic related to women in the circus, because the museum is doing a lot of work in that area this year due to an NEA grant on the subject. But these are areas they were exploring long before, and really, again, bring new voices into the mix for us at the museum. So I'm looking forward to that. I think we've got a few more minutes if there are any final questions or thoughts. Ingrid?
I'm wondering, is Ms. Kellem still associated with the Barnum Museum? And
Yep, I'm on the board of the Barnum Museum, as is one of our other attendees, Bruce Holloway, that you can see here.
I have a cousin who lives in Stratford, and when I visited him once, he took me there. It's a wonderful place. Everybody who's in Connecticut should go.
The Barnum Museum has a great YouTube channel they've launched, so you can check that out.
Oh, excellent. Thank you.
If I could just chime in here, a terrific job, Betsy. And Ingrid, the Circus Historical Society is going to have its annual convention in September in connection with the Barnum Museum. So hopefully you'll be able to join us in September for the annual convention.
And I see, Kay, you've got your hand up if you want to unmute. We'd love to hear from you.
What I think is amazing is that her disability was not a disability. It's what made her who she was, and it never held her back. And look at all the people she helped. I think it's wonderful. And thank you for this presentation. It was just great.
Well, thank you. No, I think you're absolutely right. She believed in her own uniqueness and her own wonder.
Thank you.
That reminded me of another plug that I need to give. I'm sorry. Coming up in June, another part of what the museum has been working on, and somehow I've roped Betsy into this too, although you volunteered. We are working with New College of Florida to host a conference virtually this June on the variable body. And this is scholars exploring the kinds of questions about what does a difference of a body mean, and how do we experience things differently? What kind of questions are raised by that? What I particularly appreciate about this series, which is founded out of the University of Winchester, is that it is the approach about the variability of a body, that bodies are all able, it's that it is different for different ones. And that, I think, is a really important framework for us to be applying both to these performers in history who were thought of as human curiosities because of their physical differences, but also performers themselves who we think of in the center ring. The kind of work that you do to refine a body to perform is extraordinary in and of itself. And so that's another area that I'm very much looking forward to diving deeper in with museum programming. See, I see Debbie has a hand up.
Yes, I was detained and couldn't come in at the beginning of the lecture. So is it I see it's recording. Is it going to be available to us?
Yes, we will process it and put it up on the Ringling Museum's YouTube page. And so that link will be publicly available.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I see Kathleen, you have your hand up as well.
Oh, she's muted. So while she's unmuting herself, I'm going to say we are joined by the director of the Barnum Museum and a dear friend, Kathleen Mayer.
Well, thank you so much. This was fantastic. Betsy and Bruce are champions of all things Barnum up here in New England. So this was terrific. But yeah, I want to thank you because this has been, I give lectures all the time too, and talk more about the Joyce Heth attraction. And how do we really talk about that today? It has changed in the last year. It most certainly has. How you present. It's always been sensitive, but it has been heightened as far as how do you gauge your audience and make sure that they're comfortable with this conversation as well. It's an enormous responsibility. So Jen, I think, and Betsy, as time moves forward and we work on re-envisioning the museum, to put a committee together so collectively we can find a voice together that we can all share and express. That would be fantastic. And I also want to give a shout out to Florida, because there are some great programs coming out of Florida, and we are working with, let me say this, the program director and professor of practice themed environment integration at City Lab Orlando. Have you heard of that? Because they are looking to the circus arts and circus history as part of their graduate program curriculums. So we can talk more about that now. So these conversations just getting better and better. Hey, Betsy. So thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you, Kathy. It's wonderful to see you. I'm so glad you joined us. And I've noticed the names of other colleagues within the field of circus history here with us. I'm not going to make everybody show themselves unless they want to, but this is a marvelous community in being supportive of one another's research, and also in wanting to dive deeper into topics and to do history as well as we all can. So I'm grateful to all of you who made time to join us today. And I think that we are nearing the end of our time. So I think I will stay here a little bit if there's last questions, but yes, let's all give Betsy a virtual round of applause for an amazing presentation. Thank you
guys
so
for taking
much.
time out of your day.
Yes, thank you all. And please watch for our programming. We would love to have you join us again.
As a Black circus performer, I just want to thank you so very much. My name is Denise Payne. Thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Thank you, Denise.
Denise, thank you so much. I listened to your talk with Veronica Blair. Was it 2 weeks ago now? And your story is wonderful. That was such a great program. So I'm glad you could join us.
Oh, thank you. Very interesting.